There's an interesting, back to something you talked about earlier, Chris, around productivity, because there is a connection between housing unaffordability and economic productivity, isn't there? And it's probably not talked about enough. I know that Michelle Adair has mentioned it in some of our interviews with her. Can you explain how that works for us?
So I think this is an interesting area, the links between like the housing system and the economy in general.
Yeah.
The arguments are quite difficult to explain, though, so that might explain explain why it hasn't gained a lot of traction. But I think the policymakers are beginning to recognise that this is an important area. So we're getting more visibility now. Um, so I mean, effectively, we know that Australian productivity is declining, right? So the output per hour worked is falling, and it has been for the last 10 to 15 years. Um, and so some of the projects I've been involved in or led over the last few years have looked at the idea, maybe the housing system is actually part of the cause of that declining productivity. Uh, and so I think the easiest way to explain it is if you think about a much older established worker, in general, they have a higher salary because the productivity is higher. And so in productivity studies, wages and productivity is kind of seen as very highly correlated. Um, if you think about younger workers, so recent university graduates, for example, so they're entering the workforce at much lower wage rates. Why? Because they're inexperienced, so the productivity is lower. But their productivity as individual workers is increasing quickly. So they're learning very quickly in the workplace. They're learning from peers and mentors and coaches. They're learning in job-based learning, and so the salaries are going up very quickly. So as individual people, they are high productivity growth. Um, if you think about the older established workers, the productivity is high, but it's not really growing anymore year to year. They kind of like me, have kind of plateaued. And so then if we look at the housing system and make it completely unaffordable so that you're living in Sydney and you need to travel 2 hours plus to get into the city centre if you're a young graduate, if that's actually displacing those people, making them have different choices, what you're doing is you're taking high productivity growth individuals, displacing them, you aggregate that up, and you end up with a poorer productivity outcome for the economy overall. That's probably the easiest way I could explain that theory.
It's an interesting one. I'm sort of mulling over it.
Well, I mean, I think it's but prior to COVID, and this is why I think COVID's been a good thing, right? I mean, the remote work, if it gives people the option to have a housing solution, because if you can't get a housing solution, not just in the short term to rent, which is difficult, but then also to own and potentially have a family and etc., then you're going to consider other cities. You're going to consider moving regionally, overseas, etc. So if a city doesn't give you that option, but I think COVID and remote work gives people the ability to live in those commuter cities and potentially, travel in 2 or 3 days. So it's actually a viable solution to stay within a capital city, but not have to leave to a whole other new city or country. Do you think that's why we should more encourage this remote work and flexible work as one of the, I guess, solutions to keep increasing productivity?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point, and a lot of this work that we've done on productivity predates the pandemic. So so we were looking at questions such as how long do people commute before it becomes unacceptable, and they start making different choices, and it sort of impacts on productivity. So the flexible working thing, I mean, could be an antidote to some of those problems. So if people are able to live a bit more remotely but still work flexibly, and then commute in a couple of days a week, then that could be a partial solution to that.